Hello, everyone. Happy February. My name, once again, is Chris Georgen, co founder over at Topl and the host for today's episode of Purpose, Planet, and Profit, part of the Let's Talk Supply Chain network of podcasts. I'm joined today by my guest, Jim Blackburn, and we are going to be having a carbon and sustainability focused conversation today. It seems like if there's anything in the news over the last 2 years as talked about as COVID, it is the environment and what we can do about it. So incredibly excited for this conversation today. As always, everyone is more than welcome and encouraged to submit your comments, submit your questions as Jim and I are having this conversation to kind of take it in the way that's most interesting for all of you listening. So your chats, your comments, share them with us, and we'll address them as we're going. So thank you all again for joining us. Jim, thank you for joining. You are a longtime environmental lawyer and just have been so active in the climate and environmental space for years now. Maybe you could just start off telling us a little bit about your background and your journey into carbon, so to speak.
Well, good morning, Chris. It's nice to be here. And yeah, it's been a kind of a, like all of us, it's kind of a strange journey to where we end up today in many ways. I was in law school a long time ago when many of these environmental laws were first being passed. And I decided I wanted to be an environmental lawyer. I didn't particularly like law school or even the legal profession that much, but environment was a positive thing. And I got a fellowship to come to Rice University and got a master's degree after law school. And in the kind of mid to late 70s, there weren't many people around with knowledge about environmental. So I kind of have one foot in planning, environmental planning, one foot in environmental law. And I started teaching at Rice, and I teach environmental law and I teach sustainable design. So all of those things kind of came together over the course of my career. And most of my legal work has been litigation on behalf of environmentally oriented clients. And there's not always a lot of money in that. So, I did some planning, did some teaching, and did some litigation. So it's worked out very nicely for me over the years.
Very interesting. And so kind of with that background going all the way back to the 70s, I mean, climate is really having a moment over the last 5 years especially. Have there been other times or other events kind of maybe through the 70s, 80s, 90s where we also kind of had a lot of increased interest in these issues, or we really kind of at an all-time high in terms of awareness of these issues?
Well, I think it's a very different time than in the past. In the past, there have been waves that came through, you might almost say professional waves. Clean Water Act came through, and there was all of the interest in water pollution. And then, the Clean Air Act in 77 really got serious and a lot more modeling type of thing. And another wave, the hazardous waste laws came through. But all of this carbon work is being done without laws. And I think that's the most fascinating part of it. This has all been private sector response to really a very interesting kind of combination of events. We had the Trump administration that was sort of anti-climate at a time when the financial world became interested in climate. So it's all happening sort of outside of government, which is, from my perspective, very interesting. Basically, we're developing a new economy. And I don't know that you can legislate a new economy, but you can certainly do it with the financial sector and corporate response.
I love that. And so let's kind of dive right in and talk about like what a lot of your work right now is focused on around this new carbon standard, BCarbon, which is, as you're alluding to, very markets focused and kind of has a bit of a new approach. Maybe you could tell us about that.
Well, sure. We got into the carbon market kind of in a strange way. I am co-director of the Severe Storm Center at Rice University, and we were studying lessons learned from Hurricane Ike, which really devastated the upper Texas coast. But luckily, Houston was kind of spared, but from kind of Galveston Bay to the east was heavily impacted. And we noticed nature did a lot better than human settlements did. The marshes had restored very quickly. And so we're trying to figure out how to pay landowners for to protect these wetlands. You're never going to regulate in Texas. That's just not going to happen. So we had to find ways to do it. And carbon sequestration is something that we thought that the landowners ought to be able to get paid for, and started studying the international system that is called, it comes out of the Clean Development Mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol of 1997, an international protocol. And frankly, it's just highly dysfunctional. It doesn't work for landowners. We talked to a lot of landowners in Texas, and we told them what the terms and conditions were, and they said, no, there's no way. We just simply either cannot or will not participate.
Yep.
And so to do what we needed to do, we had to develop something that was more responsive to landowner needs. And so I went to the Baker Institute at Rice, and we formed a stakeholder group and began working on developing our own standard, which has ultimately become BCarbon.
Interesting. I mean, and it makes sense, right? We're all benefiting from this nature-based resiliency that might exist in the marshland or in other environments. So everyone's benefiting from it, but there might be a cost that's only been bared or borne by a few. And so we're looking to markets to say, how can we further incentivize that behavior, essentially? And I think with the uptick of kind of some of these severe weather events, and I think we're very familiar with them in Texas, whether it's the flooding or whether it's the winter storms that we've been having these last few years. I think more of the focus on that resiliency will be more and more important. So you mentioned this working group. I think when Topl got involved at the beginning of the pandemic, maybe 30 people or something like that, and it's over a few hundred right now. That is a lot to manage, and that feels there's a lot of collaborative design whenever you get to that number of people. Maybe what's that been like, and how do you manage so many different inputs and kind of so many different perspectives to kind of all bring everyone together?
Well, I would tell you, on the one hand, it's been a tremendous learning experience working really with this group that has continued, but really organically to grow. First of all, a lot of the entities that are creating registries for carbon standards or for carbon trading, a lot of these entities are pay to play. You put up $10,000 to participate, or $50,000, or perhaps more. Yeah. And we decided we wanted to go with a not pay to play. So anyone who wants to join our stakeholder group is welcome. And we started with that approach. And I started with a number of people that I had worked with in the past, and a few that I had actually sued in the past. But we knew each other, and we ended up with good working relationships. Sometimes through litigation, you actually come to appreciate the other side, and we formed some friendships and some relationships, and so that we all came together, and it's been fabulous in several respects. First of all, we have an excellent facilitator. Robin Rather of Collective Strength in Austin is our facilitator, and she's just got a really nice touch with working with the group. We have brought together, we're now over 330 stakeholders. We've grown that much in 2 years from 40. And Robin,
those are startup numbers right there.
Listen, I mean, that's incredible. And it's really about, it's business, it's environmentalists, it's academics, it's government officials. State of New Mexico, state of North Dakota are participants with us. Representative for Vermont, Texas Parks and Wildlife is participating. So we have a kind of a diversity, and we don't really fight. I mean, we don't get into these horrible arguments that seem to be pervasive in Congress. We don't have that problem because everybody's working toward a common goal, which is to help landowners realize income from carbon sequestration, and really helping them become carbon farmers, and also helping the companies figure out how to deal with the problem they've got, which is reducing their emissions of carbon dioxide or removing their CO2 from the atmosphere once emitted. And that's really more of what we are. We're nature-based carbon capture and storage. And we literally are about removing and storing carbon dioxide, kind of locking it up, and then allowing it to be deducted from a emissions inventory.
Yeah. So, you mentioned this kind of concept that BCarbon has come up with a new standard for measuring and verifying this. But I remember from the early days of the working group, it wasn't always the plan that there was going to be a new standard that came out of it, and there ultimately was. Could you speak to the BCarbon standard? What drove the decision to come up with a new model, and how that model is different?
Well, I mean, that international model that I called dysfunctional is basically, it has a set of barriers to participation. And I think, it was developed to prevent international or fraud between governments. It was, this was about the developed world paying money to the less developed world for saving the Amazon basin, or for massive kind of protection programs and carbon capture and storage programs of different types like that. But there were a lot of barriers to prevent fraud, and understand the need for that, particularly at the international level. But, there were things like, if more than 25% of your neighbors were using the same management practices, you didn't qualify. If you were already making money on your property, you wouldn't qualify. There were time requirements of, some require 100 years dedication of the land. Many require 20 to 50 years of dedication. And the farmers and ranchers we talked to just couldn't live with the barriers. They're making money now, but not a lot, but they would like to make more. And so carbon would really help keep them in the farming and ranching business. What we've learned is that we think that with the standard that we've developed, which basically says a landowner can participate if they are willing to dedicate their land for 10 years for each time they make a transaction. So it's a rolling 10-year requirement, and they're not allowed to plow. Plowing is the enemy of carbon in the soil.
Because it re-releases the carbon effectively?
It brings oxygen down into the stored carbon, and that'll basically encourage aerobic activity, and that'll cause CO2 emission. So that carbon will get consumed probably by aerobic bacteria. And so it's the enemy of storage. So we have restrictions on the landowner. The buyers we talked to said they would be fine as long as they were sure that they were actually buying carbon that was stored in the soil. They didn't want a computer model. They didn't want some algorithm about it. So we have a very rigorous measuring requirement. There has to be, you cannot participate in BCarbon if you don't start with measurement. And then there's a 5-year measurement, and there's a true up process where we actually calculate the amount of carbon that has been stored since the testing began. And then that is what we're allowing ultimately to be transacted. And we have a way of issuing interim credits that will kind of defray the cost of testing, but we're being very conservative with those interim credits.
Sure. So some of the mechanisms, and it sounds like a lot of the other mechanisms maybe didn't have interim credits, but if they had these timelines of 25, 50, or 100 years, would you only get the carbon credits like a decade?
No. You would. I think they make the awards of credits based on the representations, but again, some of them give credits for just protecting land, avoiding conversion. Well, that's not actually capture and storage in the new year.
Right.
So we talk about providing fresh carbon, new carbon that's been captured. So kind of fresh carbon credits. And we so far have not given credits for in agriculture. If you reduce for example, the application of nitrogen fertilizer, there can be credits given for reduction of N2O emissions, and N2O is a powerful greenhouse gas. So there's different types of credits, and right now we are strictly limiting ourselves to carbon capture and storage. We are currently doing it just for soil, although we're developing a forest protocol, and we're looking at biodiversity credits as well. And a lot of our landowners say, look, we do more than put carbon in the ground. We help biodiversity. If you're restoring a grassland, you have helped. Really, the most impacted area of American birds is in grassland birds. So you're basically restoring habitat that we have really destroyed. But there's no credit for that. You can do, if you restore grassland, you can knock the peak off of floods coming down your river systems or stream systems, and you can store water in the soil. and have more resilience to drought. Well, those are things we don't value yet. So a lot of this is about environmental economics and how do you value natural services, and then trying to put that into our market. And when I talk about an economy in transition, a new economy developing, I think we're moving toward an economy that is more in keeping with the Earth's natural cycles, and that will hopefully send positive financial signals about the practices that we need to have to maintain the Earth. Because ultimately, this is about Earth maintenance. And if we don't get the atmosphere maintained and frankly reduced in terms of CO2, we're all going to have a pretty harsh future.
Yeah. No, and I love that kind of broader idea of, just more diverse environmental markets and stuff. But it's kind of, what startups get told all the time is there's ultimately this huge and exciting market that you can grow into, but there's always one particular place you need to start. And for you guys, it's, soil carbon, and then it will grow and multiply and find new markets from there. So I love the startup parallel, even though this is this is structured very differently and this is very different work. But I love
kind of we set ourselves up as a nonprofit because we didn't want to get caught up in a situation where we were making money hand over fist by just issuing these credits. And there might be a tendency to perhaps become more lax in our standards,
because that's the incentive.
We can make more money. And here, as a nonprofit, I think we're much more oriented toward the long-term goals, which are going to be climate related. We want to make sure we're taking care of the climate issue here. We want to make sure these credits are real. And we want to make sure that we don't get too far out over our skis in terms of the financial kind of income side. And so we're very cautious.
Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. And, that incentive alignment and watching what those incentives are is incredibly important. One of the things you alluded to earlier was this kind of interest on, from corporations and on the private market side. What's been driving that, do you think, over these last few years? I feel like in the run up to COP26 in Glasgow, there was just more conversation about that than any other climate event I think I had ever heard of, at least. What do you think is driving some of this interest?
Well, I think it actually goes back, well before COP26. I think certainly the Paris Accord back in 2016. I mean, that was a huge thing where they, basically everybody in the world committed that they needed to try to keep the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade, no more than 2 degrees. And although it wasn't a lot of action initially, that has stuck as a kind of, if you will, a goal. And to get there, we're going to have net zero emissions by 2050. So, so you've got these, you've got benchmarks out there.
Yeah.
Now, there hadn't been a lot of progress toward it. But when I first started looking into the voluntary market, a lot of people said, don't go into the voluntary market. It's never going to happen. That was back in like 2013, 2014. And there was no market at that point in time. But I was told if BlackRock Financial ever makes a move, that will change things. Well, in January of 2020, BlackRock Financial announced that it was going to change its policies relative to carbon, that it was going to, I think, begin to vote its carbon share or its stock shares, which they have, it's a $1 trillion plus.
Largest asset manager in the world, I believe. Yeah.
So they've got serious financial involvement in a lot of corporations. And when they start saying we're going to start voting carbon related issues with our stock shares and with our whatever power we have, and I think they said they were going to divest in their coal investments and then set up ESG funds. Which are environmental, social, and governance fund, which is kind of the code word for carbon in a lot of ways. And all of a sudden, there were just shockwaves that kind of went out in the financial world. And I started getting all of these calls. What is this ESG stuff? And how do I work with it? These are all kind of hard-nosed oil and gas people from here in Houston that nobody had ever asked them about what their carbon plan was.
Wasn't on their radar at all. Yeah.
Well, it is now. And it's on everybody's radar now. And I would tell you the financial impact has been incredible. in terms of the role of the financial institutions has been incredible.
Interesting. Basically, this driver that in order to get access to capital at the best rates, you need these plans in place. You need to be able to answer these ESG and these carbon related questions, or no money.
Right. In Houston, back in 2018, 2019, if you, if I spoke publicly about climate change, and I did quite a lot, there's a lot of people that wouldn't talk with me. There's a lot of people that didn't want to be associated because I was talking about climate change.
Yeah.
That conversation changed in January of 2020 as well. Bobby Tudor, who was the president of the Houston Partnership at that time, basically made a speech saying Houston has to be at the head of the energy transition and at carbon sequestration. And that includes technological sequestration, but also nature-based. So those conversations happened, basically those two events happened in the same month in 2020, and then the pandemic hit.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden, so I would tell you this massive change has been going on in almost every industry. And it has happened kind of under the cloak of the pandemic, where we were not working together. We were not having public meetings. And so I think that's one reason our stakeholder group expanded a lot during that time period is all of these kind of reverberations are going on out there and nobody really quite understands what's going on.
Right.
And so I would tell you right now, it's a bit chaotic in the buyer's side of things. I think they're all looking at three concepts.
Okay.
First of all, they're all creating emissions inventories if they didn't have them previously. Now, most major corporations knew what their emissions inventory was, but many of these smaller oil and gas operations, people that are, not want to say they're mom and pop. I mean, they're significant, but they're not the majors.
And there's a lot of those companies in the
there's a lot of those companies. Many of those had not done their carbon footprints. They just had no idea about these issues. All of them now are beginning to understand their carbon footprint.
Yes.
All of them are looking at, well, one, do we have an opportunity to use renewables? I know of a plastics plant that's putting in solar and wind next to their plant, and they're getting off their natural gas-fired cogen facilities.
Oh, wow.
That's one response. Efficiency. What can I do to be more efficient and burn less oil and gas? That's another response. And then if you've done those two things and you've still got emissions, you're going to have to capture them somehow. And what all these companies are beginning to understand is we can use technology or we can use nature. Well, nature has never been the friend of the oil and gas industry. Gosh, I got to deal with endangered species. I got to deal with wetlands.
What a pain to deal with.
What a pain. And all of a sudden, nature is the potential solution. And it's hard. It's just, doesn't quite penetrate. And I had one guy from oil and gas ask me how big the pipeline had to be to get the carbon dioxide to my field of grass. And no, pull it out of the atmosphere.
Yeah.
But it's a major mind shift to think of nature as a solution.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the biggest problems that we have is kind of getting that translation, because we think there's over 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide capture and storage that could come from grasslands alone. And with forest, you're easily, I think, looking at a couple of billion tons. And U.S. has got 6.5 billion tons net. So, it's easy to see nature somewhere in the 15 to 30% range in terms of.
That's substantial.
Yeah. Most of the international projections I've seen have nature between 9 and say 20%.
Okay.
But but we're talking billions of tons.
Yeah.
Certainly hundreds of millions of tons in the United States, billions of tons worldwide. And interestingly, Chris, we have had tremendous interest globally as well as within the United States. And I think that probably surprised us more than anything. But we've got interest now. We just signed a contract with Western Australia. We've got a contract in the United Kingdom. We're negotiating with some interest in South America. And in fact, 3 different countries in South America, there's interest. We're looking at a forest credit, and there's some reforestation projects that we're very interested in. Internally at Rice, we're going to be looking at endangered species and how BCarbon credits for a forest might help protect endangered species somewhere.
Sure,
So
like a lot of co-benefits and things like
yeah,
that.
we're beginning to see that stacking of benefits. And I think, when buyers of carbon are interested in two things. One, they're interested in reducing their emission footprint, but they're also interested in the story behind the credits.
Sure.
And if you're protecting, I don't know, lemurs in Madagascar, along with getting carbon credits, that's a better story than just protecting or just getting carbon credits.
Yeah.
Along the Texas coast, one of the groups that's working with BCarbon or with the Baker Institute Stakeholder group is a group called Texas Coastal Exchange. They've just announced a 1,000-mile living shoreline project for the Texas coast to try to design oyster reefs along along highly vulnerable shoreline. Sea level rise is threatening the wetlands of the world, and certainly at the Texas coast. If we could create oyster reefs as kind of buffers along the coast, we can get credits from the oyster reefs themselves. There's actually carbon storage and sequestration in oyster reefs. But if they protect the wetlands, as sea level rises, the wetlands, we're worried about them being both flooded and then sloughing off from erosion.
Sure.
If we can protect them, we can protect the wetlands. We can continue to get credits in the wetlands. And wetlands are great storers of carbon. And then but we can also get it from the oyster reef. So we could have a construction project that increases the life of our existing carbon sinks and allows landowners to get paid for it. So
right, and then protects the wetlands in such a way that helps mitigate flooding in other areas and things like that.
All of the above.
Just for the audience and myself, I guess, what is an oyster reef, Jim?
An oyster reef, oysters are, of course, bivalves that are in the estuarine areas, and they filter water. And
so actual oysters, can you harvest those oysters then? Can I get oysters out of that?
On a natural reef, you would harvest the oysters. We can put up wire baskets of filled with rocks, and oyster spat, which is the young, the juveniles, will settle on the rocks and form oyster shell. And then as you get an agglomeration of oyster shells, that becomes a reef. So we can create an oyster reef, if you will. And there's carbon that begins to be stored in that reef. And we've got people at Hart Research Institute in Corpus Christi that are studying the sequestration rates of oysters. We think there's a few tons per acre. But probably more importantly, it's what the reef protects. And if we can keep shoreline erosion from occurring, then we can get credits for the wetlands behind the reef. And so BCarbon is going to be working with Texas Coastal Exchange to try to set this up. What we're finding is there are incredible, interesting opportunities. We're looking at protecting springs in the Texas Hill Country by giving carbon credits for the forests that surround the springs, so the landowner can get paid to protect the springs, as opposed to developing the land, which is the other way most of these landowners have of making money. So we get carbon sequestration, we get springs protection, and we don't have the development.
Wow, interesting. So Jim, before we kind of end with a question as to maybe what's next, we oftentimes will have a lot of supply chain listeners and things like that. And we actually have a question here on supply chains. Obviously, kind of these major climate disruptions and a lack of resiliency can be, quite bad for supply chains. I guess one thing I'm wondering is, what do you see in terms of maybe some supply chains or logistics providers that are interested in doing some of the offsetting? So kind of where maybe do they fit in from a buyer perspective? But also, what do we think some of the risks are if we to supply chains if we don't get a handle on some of this climate stuff?
Well, I mean, I think that we're all going to suffer incredibly if we don't get a handle on the climate stuff. I think certainly the natural disasters, the weather phenomena are going to be just continue to get more and more out of control. We're already seeing projections of more Category 3, 4, and 5 hurricanes on the Gulf Coast and Atlantic Coast. We're seeing 100-year rainfalls almost every other year. So, we're seeing the impacts now, and they will only get worse. supply chains are a huge factor in carbon footprinting. Most companies have a pretty good handle on what they emit directly, which is scope 1. Sure. And they have a pretty good idea of the emissions from the electricity that they use, which is scope 2. Scope 3 is kind of the supply chain impacts. And who you buy from and who you sell to and how your product is used all kind of fits into your scope 3 carbon emissions. I think you're going to see contracts in the future where buyers will specify they want carbon neutral products, or they want to know what the carbon footprint is of the products that they're buying. And I think you will be in a better competitive position in the supply chain and being able to sell your product if you can offer carbon neutral services. Now, I will tell you, I've been a carbon neutral law firm for many years, and no one has asked me about that yet. And I've got it at the bottom of my my letterhead. It says, carbon. Nobody's ever asked me about it. So I would say it's probably not at the top of the supply chain list yet, but I think it's in there. And I think you're beginning to see companies through contracts begin to specify or at least request carbon information, if not to specify carbon information. And a lot of the, some of the companies' only alternatives will be to go to nature-based solutions. And I think that's where we come in. And so I would tell you the demand for our nature-based carbon certification will only increase going into the future. And right now, these credits are in the $20 to $25 a ton range. Okay. But in UK, they just rose from 25 euros a ton to 60 euros a ton.
That's a big jump.
In about 6 months. And so we anticipate, the technological options are in the $150 a ton range. So the nature competes nicely there. I think what it shows, though, is that there's still kind of both confusion and really a lack of full understanding of these nature-based credits and what they can do. Yeah. And I think as that kind of reality begins to be better understood, and it's good science and it's solid, but, there's some charlatans out there. There's some credits that are based on models that you might want to check out real carefully.
Sure.
And our measurement-based system, I think, will ultimately, I think it'll survive nicely just simply because people like to know that they're buying something real.
No, and that makes sense. And I think a lot of this, and we've got a question from Catherine here in the chat, assumes, or kind of my need to sequester or buy carbon kind of assumes that I can't get to carbon zero on my own. Do you expect that to still be the future, that there will just be some things that necessarily produce carbon, and so it's going to be up to other processes or nature to, kind of balance that out?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I honestly don't think hydrocarbons will be wiped from the face of the world by 2030. I think we will see hydrocarbons continue to be utilized. And I think with hydrocarbon usage, particularly like if you're using gasoline in cars, there's going to be emissions from driving those cars probably well into the future. Right. And in nature or some type of vacuum cleaner for the sky are about the only alternatives for removing that CO2. I also think a lot of companies are going to be going beyond carbon neutral. And I just saw an advertisement for a milk product that said they were going to be carbon positive.
Okay.
It's what I call carbon negative, where you're
that's what I thought the term was too. I think they're carbon positive now, and they want to get away from that.
But I think I think everybody probably likes things positively. But anyway, I call it carbon negative. But anyway, their advertisement was carbon positive. So, but I understood what they meant. But I think that we will see. I think we're going to have to probably pull more carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere than we're putting in. And the only way you can do that is either with nature or with some type of vacuum cleaner of the sky.
Sure.
And that vacuum cleaner of the sky is hard to scale. We can scale nature. Nature is scalable. It works. And so I see a huge potential there. And we're nowhere close to that yet, but I think that will ensure the market goes way beyond scopes 1, 2, and even 3 to carbon negative. And that's where I see nature frankly, being as viable in 2050 as it is in 2030.
Yeah. And I think, I think that scalability is important, right? Because there's damage that can be done for every moment that you have to wait. And so if it's very time consuming to build that vacuum cleaner, so to speak, in the meantime, we are suffering climate change and we are having those negative effects of carbon. So the faster that you can scale, it's to the benefit.
And I think the other side of it is, from the agricultural community standpoint, this is a huge opportunity, because we can do so much better in the way that we manage land.
Sure.
And, to turn the lands of the farmlands and the ranch lands of the United States into essentially an ecologically balanced system that is sequestering carbon, it would be probably the biggest nature transformation in United States history.
Wow.
I mean, it could be huge. I mean, we're talking 200 million acres of land that grows, for example, grows corn and grain to feed cows. It's cattle feed.
Yeah.
If you just turn that back to grazing land, that would be 200 million acres of sequestration we don't have right now. And most of our lands are overgrazed. Many of them are overgrazed. If you could get an extra $50 an acre out of selling carbon, you wouldn't need to overgraze. So you have ecological. That would be transformational. I mean, it's just huge. And we're also seeing a lot of land that we can't farm anymore because we're running out of water. And that you could go back to grazing. So I think it has a great future. There is a question about if there's a downside to sequestering as opposed to reducing. And I think everyone will reduce as much as they can. I think that has to be the primary goal. But we're going to need it. And so I think we ought to support it and get it started. And we're trying to do that.
Awesome. Well, Jim, this is all incredibly exciting. I guess I'll throw one last question to you. If there are any announcements or things you're really excited about that are coming up, or, maybe in the absence of that, maybe a prediction you'd like to throw out.
Well, one thing I wanted to announce is we're working with you, Chris, to create a blockchain that will keep up with these credits, because that's going to be one of the most important things, is to be able to keep up with all of these credits that are out there in commerce and making sure they're not being duplicated somewhere else, or that, that you can chase or track down the pedigree, if you will.
Absolutely.
In terms of future things, I think the whole integration of biodiversity credits into carbon credits, and basically tying ecology to these credits, I think is probably one of the biggest things that we're doing differently. And that's just something I would just say that to everybody, that, it's more than just carbon. It is kind of, how the carbon is integrated into the overall ecological system. And I guess one of the things I'm probably most worried about is that some genetically modified plant that really pumps carbon into the ground competes with our native ecosystems. And I really want to see the ecosystems be supported rather than something different. And so, but I'm sure we'll see it.
Absolutely. We're gonna see lots of solutions, hopefully, to this in the future.
We're going to see lots of solutions, and we're going to probably see lots of issues with them. So none of this is easy, but I think the thing to keep in mind is the economy is changing. Yeah. This is part of what I call the circular economy, and it's tied to the natural cycles. This is inconsistent with the carbon cycle. We're trying to get back into balance on the carbon cycle. We're talking about balancing the hydrologic cycle. And I think the closer we come to mimicking those natural cycles, the better economy we'll have.
Awesome. I like that. Love that way of thinking about it. Jim, thank you so much for joining us today. Everyone, you can learn more about this amazing work at BCarbon.org. I invite you to check it out. If you are somehow involved in this space, maybe you have carbon development projects, maybe you want to be a buyer. As Jim said, there is an open working group, so you can reach out to learn more.
Right. I mean, just write us and we'll put you in.
It's that easy. Excellent. Jim, thank you again. This was a lot of fun, and thank you all for joining us today. We'll be back again next month.
You bet, Chris. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely.